Hello, folks. Thanks for coming back to it. I've stepped into this role. Unfortunately, Chris, who you've just seen, is feeling a little bit under weather, so I'm pinch hitting for him, which is hard. He's much better looking than I am, and a better voice. I do want to thank Chris, though, for all his work on this. He's been a leader in the agriculture co-op sector in BCC for some time, one of our most engaged board members on the board. So he's a good reason why some of the content is here and some of the relationships. So we owe him that debt of gratitude and wish him to feeling better so he can join you tomorrow. I'd like to acknowledge our great morning in terms of the discussion and what's been happening, and also our sponsor, which is Co-ops and Mutuals Canada. We have Hugh Bourgeois, who can just stand up and say hi. You're not going to have to say any words, Hugh, if you don't want to. So great to have someone when the East comes West. That's always a nice sign of collaboration and cooperation. I'd like to thank all our online attendees for being with us. I know it's a tough haul sometimes being with us virtually, but we've been getting some nice comments and questions coming through. And make sure you keep care of yourself. Don't get any neck strains. And then I think I want to just underline again that there's transportation for the food hub tour. Those of you who have vehicles, great. There is if you don't have a vehicle and you want to get a ride out there, it's a bit long of a walk. There's plenty of opportunity on the Whova app, or go downstairs to the front table to hitch a ride. If you want, you can come with me. You might not like that. I'd like to introduce Eva as our next session moderator, and she'll walk you through the guests. And I just want to say Eva is one of our newer staff members and does fantastic work. She far belies her age, so I'd just like to compliment her on her work, and you're going to see much more from her in the coming years as the BCCA and ACCA work together to work with you folks more on expanding the co-op sector. Eva.
Thanks, Paul. Is this, oh yeah, that's working. Great. Thank you, Paul. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm very excited to introduce this session, but first I'll just introduce myself briefly. I am Eva Yankovic. I work with the BC Cooperative Association and now increasingly the Alberta Co-op Association. I was the co-op education coordinator for a number of years, and now I'm doing more of a cooperative education and research partnerships role, which is really exciting new change for me. And I'm very honored to facilitate this session on such a pressing topic, especially grateful to be able to have this conversation here in Kamloops, BC, in a region that has experienced some of the worst effects of the climate crisis in BC in the past year or so. It was really scary kind of driving up here and seeing a lot of the damage from the wildfires and the flooding and the highways and everything. Not to mention during a global pandemic as well, and all the other kinds of convergent disasters that we've been seeing in recent years. So it's definitely a very pressing topic, and there's been parts of the conversation already seeded earlier this morning as well. So definitely very fitting for our times here. My personal interest in community resilience and disaster recovery began back during my undergrad in UBC, where I studied urban and community planning. And I had the opportunity to take part in an experiential learning program where I developed a project called Buddy Up, which was all about building community resilience through neighborhood networking, skill sharing, and resource sharing. And I was involved in various focus groups and pilot projects with the City of Vancouver's Resilient City Strategy that were focused on strengthening neighborhood level social networks that could be mobilized in times of crisis. So kind of back to what Elliot said earlier, that it's regular people that take the biggest role in terms of responding in times of need and are most agile to be mobilized when those times come. And little did I know that several years later, I'd be involved in similar conversations as they apply to the co-op sector in the midst of the very kinds of crises we had been anticipating in those earlier years and talking about. And most notably, I've been involved with a research project studying the Canadian cooperative response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has come out with some very interesting insights into both the role that co-ops have played in their communities and also how they have themselves been affected by and responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can find out more about that project through Co-ops and Mutuals Canada, actually. And I think we should have a final report coming out soon. And all of that to say is that I'm very excited to be here and to have been given the opportunity to moderate this session and to introduce our three guests, Bill Omakin, Michael Pilbrow, and Jamie Bohatch, who will share different perspectives on the role of cooperatives in disaster response and community resilience. So Bill will kick us off and will provide an overview of stages of disaster preparedness and recovery in Wisconsin and how local co-ops have been proven to be uniquely placed to respond. Michael will then share findings from an October 2021 research report on the role of primary producer co-ops during bushfires and flooding in Australia, so quite parallel to what we've seen here. And finally, Jamie will share how insurance has been impacted by climate emergencies and what will be needed moving forward to build community resilience. And then once they've all shared, there'll be some time for discussion at your table groups and asking questions around mostly the topics of how can we build resilient local ecosystems of cooperatives, and then what is needed from a wider ecosystem perspective as well. So Bill, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Eva. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope it's okay for someone from south of the border to come and talk about experiences with disasters. We don't have anything to compare with British Columbia over this last year, although we continue to have disasters across the United States. But before I get there, I'm glad Uncle Mike came back in because attorneys have been mentioned a lot, and I happen to be an attorney, and that's part of my introduction. As Elliot said, he and I are practicing law together. But there are attorneys who can be forces for good. And I just want to give you just a little background on some of the work that I've done very, very briefly to point out that attorneys can be forces for good. I've been a cooperative attorney for 35 years and started off as a cooperative attorney in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in a law firm that actually has 12 full-time cooperative attorneys. And I know that seems kind of amazing compared to what I see in Canada and actually in other parts of the United States too, where there are not a lot of attorneys practicing cooperative law. But I come from the upper Midwest, which is really the capital of cooperatives in the United States. But as part of my work, I'm the only American official who's ever prosecuted Walmart for predatory pricing. And so Walmart has to function very differently in the state of Wisconsin than anywhere else in the United States. For the tribes of Minnesota and the tribes of Wisconsin, wild rice is a huge industry, very, very important industry in the upper Midwest for the tribes. And I prosecuted non-tribal owned companies that were trying to represent their wild rice as being produced by Native Americans. And then about 30 years ago, I've brought the first prosecutions against companies applying pesticides on top of migrant workers in the state of Minnesota. The argument that was made to me is, why do you care about migrant workers? And my response back is, they're people too, and they're not going to end up in prison, you are. And so just a little bit of background that attorneys can actually be forces for good. So let me get on the topic of today, which is really focusing on the unique role that cooperatives can play in disaster preparedness and response. And in my background, I retired from the state of Wisconsin about 5 years ago as a state disaster preparedness and response director. And if you know anything about Wisconsin, I know Canadians are much less geographically challenged than Americans can be. And that's one of the reasons why I was hoping this wouldn't be broadcast later on by making that comment, but it's true. Wisconsin is the least disaster prone part of the United States. In fact, if you saw the movie about 2012, do you remember the movie 2012 about global climate change? If you recall at the very end, they said that there's land that's been sighted as they're sailing on those I guess, magnificent boats. And if you heard that dialogue at the very end, they said land's been sighted and it's Wisconsin. Because we are considered to be the least disaster prone, but that doesn't mean that we don't prepare communities for disaster and disaster resilience, because we're the reserve supply that when Houston, Texas got hit by hurricanes, my staff and I would get called down to help the Texans respond to the hurricane, or the forest fires on the West Coast. And so we had probably the broadest knowledge of disaster preparedness response. The only difference is we weren't always doing it right in our own backyards. But Canada has certainly seen a number of disasters. This is from the government of Canada, one of the websites, $2.1 billion in 2021, sixth costliest since 1983. And I know Americans have a rap because we always have to say that we have the bigger buildings and all that kind of stuff. Our comparative number for the United States was about 120 billion in losses from disasters in 2021. But that doesn't mean the disasters weren't cataclysmic. We were all horrified in Wisconsin to watch the forest fires here in British Columbia, and then followed by the floods, because we knew that very well could happen to us in the upper Midwest. And you can see on the right side just a list of some of the events: the record heat, the British Columbia floods, which I've already talked about, just a number of different disasters. And the reality is these are going to be happening more and more and more. And politics in the United States, very topsy-turvy. When I was the state director of preparedness and response, my governor, who was Republican, said I could not actually use the word global climate change. And when I would do presentations, I'd have to have 12 staff in the secretary of the minister's office who would review my presentations, and they would X that out, and then I would just go out and speak and just use the word global climate change instead of, well, you can fire me if you want. Go ahead. They never did. But anyway, reality is with global climate change, we're going to see more and more disasters, whether or not you think it's happening, whether or not you think it's the result of human activity. The fact is climate is changing, and it's going to result in more disasters. So there's 4 stages of a disaster. One, which is one of my primary focuses when I work for the state of Wisconsin, is mitigation. How do you go about building that resilience for the community in the advance of the disaster? Because then at least you have some preparedness in advance. And so preparedness is a really, really important component of disaster response. And that ties in with the preparedness next. Once you get into response, it's too late to do the preparedness, obviously, because you're in the midst of the disaster. And I think something that drew me to this area, because before I worked for the state, and as I said, I have been a cooperative attorney for a long time, but I was on the board of the Red Cross for the 5 states of the upper Midwest and chair of disaster preparedness and response for the Red Cross there. But one of the things that I learned is you've got to have a vibrant response. It's got to be locally based, because if it's the federal government or the state coming in to provide that response, in many cases, not going to be terribly effective. No offense if there are any provincial ministry folks that are still here, but it really needs to be a locally based response. And that's why co-ops have such a unique role. And then you get into the recovery, the 4th stage, and there too cooperatives have a unique role, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And again, I'm going through these slides really fast because I'm hoping we can get more on the questions, but they're not advancing. And we will look at our tech. So in the United States, FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Agency, has lifelines. There are 8 lifelines, and safety and security, flood, water, shelter, saying you want to make sure that in a disaster you can provide people with water, with shelter, health and medical, an area that I happen to specialize in, energy, communications, transportation. And so our disaster response efforts really focused around these lifelines. And the reason why the lifelines are denominated as such is so we don't forget about any of them. Because I'm very much into a systems risk approach. It's been my observation over my career that people tend to get very focused on one discrete part of risk, and then they miss all the others, and they don't see the interchanges or the exchanges between them. I look at the entire broad spectrum of risk. And so I was very glad when FEMA about 4 years ago went to this lifeline approach, because it got us thinking about all these different things that we as government officials really have to be focused on. Moving on, why do cooperatives have a preparedness and response resiliency advantage? And that's kind of a long phrase, but cooperatives are uniquely outward looking. We have member owners in our communities. You compare that to other types of corporations, for example, it may be customers, but they're not necessarily going to have a tie to our community unless they have a headquarters there or they have a substantial number of employees. But our cooperatives in Wisconsin and Minnesota, we have over 1,000 cooperatives in Minnesota, over 800 in Wisconsin. They're all over both states. And what I found is because cooperatives, the second point, are uniquely integrated in the communities, when we would have a flood or a fire or whatever, it was always the cooperative, the local farm supply cooperative, the telephone cooperative, the electric cooperative would be the first one to open up their doors, set up the cots before government ever arrived to provide people with shelter and then provide food. And they would work with the local food co-op to get food supplies. And I'll give you an example from Hurricane Katrina, and that's the top picture there. Most of you heard of Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans. And in Hurricane Katrina, FEMA was totally flummoxed. They did not know how to get resources down to New Orleans. I was sitting in my office in Madison, Wisconsin, coordinating between the electric co-ops. We're getting all of our line crews. We had them all staged, ready to go down to help set up the power grid. We connected in with the farm supply cooperatives, and we had trucks full of fuel that would power these electric trucks, the electric line trucks. And then we contracted with the food co-ops to provide the food so they could bring the food with them and the refrigeration. And when we got down to New Orleans, FEMA started seizing all of our fuel trucks. And they said, we can't get fuel from anywhere else. But they said, how did you know enough to have fuel go with your electric line trucks? And I'm like, well, you know, the electric co-op manager knows the farm supply co-op manager who knows the food co-op manager. A lot of their board directors serve on multiple co-op boards. So it was a no-brainer to us. And FEMA said, and I was at a conference across the street from the White House a couple of years ago, and what the associate director of FEMA said, oh my God, how did you guys figure this out? And I said, we didn't figure it out. It was just part of the natural landscape for cooperatives. We just knew because we already had that infrastructure. And if you know one thing about a disaster response, the most effective disaster responses is where everyone who's going to respond knows everybody before the disaster happens. And we were the only group of people where we already knew everybody. And so that's why we were so effective in Katrina and other disasters. Also, we had different set of values. And for example, our line trucks, our electric line trucks went down into some of the poorest parishes north of New Orleans, predominantly African-American Black parishes. And they were instructed by those in Louisiana to move to different places to put up the power grid, which happened to be mostly white, predominantly white neighborhoods. And so our staff said, what do we do? We're getting the instructions. I said, you stay right where you are. You stay in those poor communities. You get their power set up. We're not moving anywhere else. And I didn't include any of these pictures, but we had just these wonderful outpouring of community support, thanking the Wisconsin Electric Cooperatives for getting their power grid up. When everybody else from other states tended to go where they were told, we didn't. We went where we arrived, and that's where we set up the power grid. But our cooperatives, many of our members are already first responders. They're the heads of EMS, emergency medical service in their community, the local fire department. So again, we have training that lots of others don't do. And the electric utilities the investor owns, they don't talk to each other like our electric cooperatives do. And you know, I could say that I'm just giving you a bunch of propaganda here, but I directly observe this as the state official responsible for doing the disaster response, that cooperatives were uniquely challenged. So I thought, well, if co-ops are so good at this, how do we integrate this into the state of Wisconsin's approach to disaster response? And so we set up a series of emergency preparedness coalitions. Now, these are tied to health in this case, because we've been going through a pandemic, but other types of emergencies as well. So we created these. And what we did is we created cooperatives of hospitals, law enforcement, first responders, and local businesses, so that they already had that network in place. They already knew each other. So in the case the next disaster happens in Northeast Wisconsin, because they have a major ice storm, that system's already going to be there, and it's going to be much more effective, evidence demonstrates, in responding than they otherwise would have. And then I provided substantial funding out of my budget on an annual basis, and that allowed them to actually hire full-time staff. And so then they're starting to train all these local providers, EMS, hospitals, and others, to get them well coordinated. We do a lot of what we call wargaming. We'd have an ice storm. We don't have earthquakes in Wisconsin for the most part, but we've been helping the West Coast with their Cascadia earthquake response. And FEMA saw this as a pretty interesting model, because they said, well, we never really thought about doing these as cooperatives. And I said, it makes sense, because people know that they're all part of an effort where individually they can't get something done, but together they can achieve so much more. Just finishing up here, we have a pretty robust disaster insurance program in the United States. The four that are listed there are all cooperatives. Farm Credit, I happen to be on the national board, 8-member national board. It's owned by 500,000 farmers across the United States, and we have about $370 billion in assets. We have a lot of assets to deploy in a disaster, and we both do the insurance side, but we donate many, many millions of dollars for disaster response. American Family is actually headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm from, and they're a mutual insurance company, and they're very, very much into disaster response. Liberty Mutual, if you're in this state, you'll see their kind of silly commercials. And then Nationwide Insurance, also cooperative. And so some of our largest insurers are cooperatives and very much involved in disaster preparedness. And then just as a final comment, I'd love to talk more about the individual response on farms. I didn't have enough time to do that because we have other speakers, but if you bring that up in questions, because I've been providing guidance at no cost to a number of folks in British Columbia about how best farms can respond to disasters here in this province. And I should just finish out by saying I am a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan. And I'm a fellow at the Canadian Center for Cooperatives. Mark Andres here and Murray, they're both co-chairs of my PhD committee. And if I did point them out, I'd probably be in trouble. Be 10 years before I get my PhD, but they've been really, really great to work with. And even though I have an American perspective, I very much have a Canadian perspective as well. So with that, I will stop. Look forward to my other two co-panelists.
Thanks so much, Bill. Yeah, lots of great insights there, especially I think the one about the mobilizing relationships, like building the relationships before something happens. Those are the ones that can be most effective going into a disaster response. I'd like to invite Michael, if you're with us over Zoom.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'll just share my screen and bring greetings from Yass in Australia. Can I just check that you can see my screen, my presentation? Yeah. Wonderful. So I am coming from Yass in Australia. Yass is a small agricultural community a few hours from Sydney, and a wonderful part of the country. And I'm very pleased to join you, in all of you in Canada there. And just one quick part of my background is that following Bill, I spent part of my childhood in Wisconsin, which is sort of bizarre. And that's where I developed a love of the Green Bay Packers, and have actually taken that interest in sport and co-ops into setting up a sporting co-op in Australia, modeled on the Green Bay Packers. So anyway, that's just a little bit about me. I bring a background in international work as a diplomat and as a working in some humanitarian recovery programs in Asia and the Pacific, and also involved in setting up co-ops. So it's really quite perfect for me and my team to be involved in a really significant report last year about the role of primary producer co-ops in disaster recovery and resilience. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. And I know you've all got access to that report. I'll put a link to it shortly in the presentation, but I think you may have access to that already. So wonderful to be here. Just a little bit about co-ops in Australia before I get on to talking about what we discovered in our work on this report. So there's over 2,000 co-ops in Australia. About 10% of those are agricultural cooperatives. The most interesting thing is 80% of Australians are members of at least one co-op or mutual, but only about 20% know it. I don't know if that's replicated in other countries. So we do need to do more here to let people know they're actually already members of co-ops. That's a massive, I'm not sure there's any other sort of sector of industry of the economy that would have 80% involved in that way. And the co-op principles are enshrined in legislation in every state and nationally. So this is the report we produced last year. As you would know, I'm not going to dwell on the disasters that we've had, but you will have seen in your on the news about the bushfires we had a couple of years ago. And we've just recently had disastrous floods. I mean, still the immediate response phase is still going on. So that's the story of the last few years in Australia, is ongoing disasters. I won't dwell on them. I really want to focus on the role of the co-ops in responding to them. And we did this report to look at what the actual, we kind of intuitively knew that co-ops had a special role in helping communities recover, but we decided to we're commissioned by the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals here in Australia to do a study looking at it. The study was primarily story-based. When we started talking to the communities that had been through these disasters, they'd been consulted, pretty weary and tired and exhausted from not just their own recovery work, but also the consultation that had happened in so many other for so many other reviews and inquiries. So they agreed to just let us tell our story. So that's what we did. So we did that with four co-ops, the Cobargo Co-op, Ori Co-op, which is national, Sweeter Banana in Western Australia, and Tafco in the state of Victoria. I'll just share about two of these today, just given the time, but encourage you to have a read of the report, and very happy to continue dialogue on any of these. The first one I want to share about is Cobargo. And if you did see the news, that was the sort of the front, sort of ground zero for the fires in some way, certainly in a public sort of media way, because it's where there were some particular moments where the Prime Minister of Australia visited Cobargo, and it was quite a controversial day. They got the full force of the fires, a very small community, and it happened on New Year's Eve, and the fire came through and wiped out a large proportion of this small community. At the heart of the sort of main small shopping street of Cobargo is the Cobargo Co-op, which was started as a dairy farmer producer co-op, but has sort of broadened into a rural and agricultural supplies co-op that nearly everyone in the community is a member of. That's what it looks like inside the sort of physical space they have in the town. It's the go-to place for everyone in this small community to go and get their supplies. But they have, as co-ops do, they have a much broader social vision to be a vibrant and interactive place, to be the hub of the community there in Cobargo. After the fires, the Cobargo Co-op really kicked into action. It actually became ground zero for the recovery. Their physical structure survived amazingly, so it really became the hub of the community in organising a lot of the immediate response, and then also the longer term economic recovery. As their manager said, we're not just a shop, we're a co-op. Their communication mechanisms, pretty much everyone's a member, so their communication mechanisms were able to get to everybody very quickly, and they played a really pivotal role in helping in the immediate aftermath of the fire. But interestingly, they've actually grown since that time. I think there's the level of trust that they had in their community, just really encouraged people who weren't members to join, people to shop there more. So they've actually grown, and they're a relatively small enterprise, but they've grown in that time. They have increased their membership, increased the number of jobs, and it's been a pretty impressive way in which they've grown over that time. I mean, key lessons from Cobargo was, I guess, then these feed into the lessons from all of the co-ops around the high level of trust when there's government and so many other organisations running around looking to be part of the recovery. The co-op really was, for so many people, the one that they trusted. They also had, really clear member-based governance, as co-ops do, that allowed for quick and trusted decision making in the aftermath of that disaster. Moving on to the next one, but I do encourage you, if you're ever in Australia, visit the Cobargo Co-op. You can see what a beautiful little spot it is there. But moving on to the next one, Ori Co-op is a national co-op that is supporting organic and regeneratively managed farming across Australia. So they're not in one location like Cobargo, but they are across the country. A lot of their farmers were affected by the bushfires and then immediately by floods. So we had floods in 2020, but we had even worse floods in early 2022. They provide sort of expert consultants and specialists on organic farming to help the farmers. And so immediately they kicked into action and supported their farmers. Not just through they got money and donations to the farmers, but actually there was a big role in providing emotional support. So that was something that Ori Co-op really got involved with as well. Were really interesting thing we saw from a number of the co-ops was how they were able to leverage money immediately after a disaster. So they were getting donations from here. They used that donation to encourage others to give more, then government to maybe match it. And so they were able to very quickly turn, this example of a relatively small amount of their own fundraising of sort of around $90,000 very quickly turned into nearly $500,000 just through very clever sort of trusted negotiations with other donors. And so they are developing sort of a longer term resilience fund. So to help learn from the lessons from this response and recovery to plan for future ones. Again, the faith, trust, social networks were the things that we heard really strongly from Ori Co-op and from all the co-ops, which really led to just moving along. It was very much recognised that after the bushfires, the community led, the trust, the ability to distribute aid quickly, and sort of existing social capital and bonds were really crucial. And I just want to sort of finish with I guess the punchline from our report, and we have presented this to government. When we look at those two examples and the other two that I mentioned, what is it about them? And it was just so clear that compared to government, compared to private sector, compared to other community groups, all of which have a really important role to play, co-ops had a really particularly special and valuable and often unrecognised role, being member-owned, pooling risk, buying power, the existing social connections that already were in place through the co-op meant that they could get that communication and that support going really quickly. And in some cases, having a physical place to meet. So we have sent some recommendations to government. And the first one on this screen, I'll just show you, which is cooperatives deserve a seat at the table. Often co-ops aren't in the roundtables that happen after disasters. We're saying they should be, and government and the whole community will benefit. I won't run through all these recommendations, they're in our report, but we did present some pretty detailed recommendations to government and are in conversation with them now about how co-ops can help plan for being much better prepared for the next disaster that comes along. And finally, I'll just leave you this quote from Professor Mary O'Kane, who was the chair of the bushfire inquiry. She's a very close friend of ours in the co-op sector. She's just been appointed chair of the flood inquiry, and she has gone out very publicly and said this about the role of co-ops in disaster resilience, disaster preparedness, and disaster recovery. And really appreciate the chance to very quickly share these stories from Australia today, and look forward to the conversation that will follow. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. I mean, okay. Thanks so much, Michael. 3 times. Thanks a lot. I highly recommend checking out the report. I think as much as we do kind of intuitively have the sense that co-ops play an important role, the role of research is really important. And the role of developing these stories and case studies really supports, I think, especially this idea of having a seat at the table and being able to really demonstrate the role that cooperatives play. So now I'd like to invite our final speaker, Jamie Bohach. Can you just let us know if you're on?
I'm here.
Hello. Take it away, Jamie.
Excellent. I think you guys are going to be sharing my presentation for me, so I'll maybe just give that a second to come up. Great, thank you. And thank you for the invite. I appreciate the chance to be here. If you can flip to the next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit about who I am and why I'm here today. So my name is Jamie Bohatch. I am part of the member and key client relations team at the Cooperators. So my role is specific to taking care of our member organizations. So Cooperators is owned by 46 member organizations across Canada. Primarily, they're cooperative. They're all Canadian, and some of them are farming organizations. So my role specifically is to to manage those relationships and manage the business that they do with us for the members that are in Western Canada. So everywhere between Manitoba and BC. Me personally, I'm actually located in Regina, Saskatchewan. So little ways away, but and still covered under copious amounts of snow that is slowly going away. So I'm kind of wishing I was in BC right now to get away from this a little bit, but slowly but surely spring is coming. So again, we really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Cooperators as an organization was founded by farmers back in the 1940s, and we're 100% committed to ensuring that the financial security of Canadian farmers nationally. So obviously, BC is part of that, and we're very happy to be here. In BC specifically, we insure about 1,800 farm risks, and based on the 2016 stats, that would give us about 11% of the market share in BC. So that's a fairly significant piece of the business when we talk about insurance and market share and things like that. So if you can flip to the next slide, please. This is just our mission statement, and I think this is important to talk about when we discuss risk and what we do in this space. And financial security for Canadians and Canadian communities is really a simple statement, but it actually carries a lot of weight. And it's really what we're about, that holistic security for people to continue to live their lives, to have that financial security they need to make appropriate decisions in their life, and to grow as families and communities. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about some events in BC. Bill kind of stole my thunder a little bit by sharing some of this already, which is okay. So I won't spend too much time. Next slide, please. This is just some of the activities. So these are, as Bill already mentioned, these are actually the top 2 news stories in BC, or news stories in Canada, and they happened in BC. So the fires that happened in the early part of the summer that resulted from the heat dome, and then leading into the massive flooding that we saw in the Sumas Prairies in the fall and into the winter months. So that's one province saw the 2 biggest climate related disasters in 1 year. Next slide, please. Goes on to talk about the rest of Canada. So BC is not on an island here by any means. These events are happening nationally. They're happening globally. Like we heard about what's going on in Australia. You can turn on the news at any point in time and you can hear about these types of events that are occurring. So these are increasing. So again, not going to spend a bunch of time. Bill already touched on this, but the next slide maybe goes into a little bit more detail about why this is important. So this slide represents the growing protection gap that exists. So the dark blue line is talking about insured losses, and then the lighter blue or almost green line is talking about uninsured losses. So as you can see, as you go across this graph from the 70s all the way to current day, there's a growing protection gap in what's insured versus what is not insured, and that is a widening gap, and that's because insurance doesn't cover absolutely everything. Insurance is a great protection. People need it, but it's not the only thing. Communities need to be more resilient. We need to adapt to adjust to these climate change activities. They're increasing in frequency. We used to talk about 1 every 10-year activities, 1 in every 10-year events. Now we're talking about how many events we're going to have in any given year. So the language has changed over the last 20 or so years that even I've been in the industry. So it's changing quickly, and we're seeing all kinds of devastation and impact that these can have on local communities. So again, that's just bringing in some pictures of an event and people living in a community center with as a result of evacuations and that sort of thing. So if you flip to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Cooperators is doing in this space. So one of the things is, as a cooperative insurance company, we tend to look at things a little bit differently than maybe some of the other investor-owned insurance companies that are out there. So one thing is staying in markets. Now that might seem like a simple thing to do, to stay and continue to sell your products, but I think what we've seen over the last couple of years with hard market conditions is what we refer to them as, where capacity starts to shrink up and prices go up. A lot of insurers are leaving marketplaces, which oftentimes can leave people without insurance and scrambling to find an alternative. So one of the things that we've been very cautious about doing is making sure we're staying there, making sure we're available to insure Canadians and that they can get products and services that meet their needs. Another thing is continuing to evaluate our product offers to ensure client needs are met. So when you think about farming and producers, especially in BC, there's a lot of overlap and crossover from farming operations to commercial operations, and sometimes there's gaps in between those operations. So we're continuing to evaluate our space there, and how do we meet those needs? How do we bridge those gaps so people's activities are covered properly when they need it? Another thing we're doing is educating clients and educating the general public. Insurance used to be always referred to as risk management. If you had insurance, you had a risk management plan in place, which it's not enough anymore to say that you have insurance. Insurance is getting very expensive because of these climate related activities. We can't rely on this as being our only means of defense for whether it's a climate related activity or something more localized. People and organizations need to learn about risk management techniques. They need to start implementing these things and becoming more resilient in their own operations. So we're working to educate communities, educate clients, educate people on things that they can do to become more resilient as individuals. We're also looking for strategic partnerships. Now, I'll give an example of one. We've partnered with a company that is providing some monitoring equipment that we can use in some large farm structures in pockets throughout Canada. It's very much in a pilot phase for now, where we are trying to predict fires in large farm complexes. So again, it's not just being there to pay for that new barn that needs to be rebuilt because there was a fire. It's let's stop that fire from ever happening and start identifying those things that can trigger that event and eliminate those things before they happen. So again, this is going back to that resiliency piece and trying to partner with other players in the area and not just keep it as an insurance related activity. We need those external experts to bring products and services into the solution so that we can continue to evolve and continue to help Canadians be more resilient. Another piece here is leading by example. So again, going back to being a cooperative insurer, I think we look at things often with a different lens than maybe some other insurance companies might approach them. I'll give some examples of the floods that happened in Calgary a few years ago. This was prior to there being any flood insurance in Canada. So most people would have to rely on government funded programs and government response to provide any kind of financial relief for those damages. What happened in Calgary, though, is there was a mixture of flood waters and sewer backup in a lot of people's basements, and you couldn't really identify what was what. So cooperators went in with the lens of, well, we can't tell if it's flood water or sewer backup because it's commingled in the basement. So we're going to at least pay up to the ground level for those losses, and then you'll have to apply for the government funding for anything above the ground level, which would be a flood loss. So by doing that, though, it changes how the industry responds. By being that first person that sticks your neck out there and say, this is how we think this should be handled, it changes through public pressure, through public opinion and media. It changes how other insurers come to the table. Similarly, with the fires in Fort McMurray that happened a few years ago, most insurance policies have a clause that will pay you for 2 weeks if you have to evacuate your home and live somewhere else during evacuation period. Obviously, that was not enough due to the devastation that was seen in the Fort McMurray area. So we extended that to about 6 weeks. And by us doing that, everybody else came along and did the same thing. So again, applying a different lens to insurance and protecting Canadians is critical in this space to change the mindset and change what other insurance companies are doing and really hold people accountable to this. So I think that's a lens we apply quite well when we're in this, and it seems to work. It works well for us, and it seems to work well for our clients, which is probably the most important thing. Next slide, please. So this might seem a little ominous, and I don't mean to scare people by it, but We've been talking about significant impacts from an insurance and financial perspective, but for cooperators specifically, the bottom line is that climate change represents a threat to our mission of financial security for Canadians and their communities. If climate change causes insurance rates to rise beyond what Canadians can afford, the protection gap and financial insecurity increases. So we've shown on that slide earlier how that protection gap is increasing over time from the 70s and to today. And that's going to continue to increase. And the cost of insurance, I'm sure most people in the room have their own insurance policies and have witnessed those values going up, and it's a real threat. So it's something that we're concerned of, both with our clients, both with our member organizations, wanting to make sure people are resilient, educated, understand how to control risk, understand how to mitigate risk, and can take some self-management from that and position themselves in the best way possible to be able to respond to these kinds of events when they do happen. Because once they happen, you can't stop them. These are climate related activities. You can't stop the floodwaters from coming. You can't stop the fires. You can try, but typically they're going to do what they're going to do. So those are real important things for us to try and educate people on and make sure they understand how to manage their risks associated with those types of events. And that is it for my presentation today. I'm absolutely looking forward to further discussion on these topics. So I thank you very much for including me in this event today. This has been great so far, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Yeah, I think there's definitely something there about the way in which a cooperative insurer just has values that are aligned with meeting the needs of communities, the way that non-cooperative entities sometimes have conflicting priorities. So yeah, I think we've had a lot of great seed for thought. Perhaps if there's any clarifying questions, we can do a few of those now, but I'd like to also get into some discussion at the table groups. There's flip chart paper that has not been actively used yet, so we want to kind of engage everyone's thinking around how we might build local response infrastructure through applying cooperative models, and then also thinking what is needed on a broader ecosystem level. But before we get into that, is there any questions? We'll maybe take 2 or 3. If not, then let's get into it. So if you're sitting at a table and there's not a whole lot of you, consider joining a table with folks. Bill, if you'd like, we can also circle the room. For online folks, you can also feel free to have a discussion on the Zoom, and we might just turn off the volume so we can't hear that discussion going live. Yeah, and then we'll reconvene in about, let's say 15 minutes.
And again, the question you're giving them is what do for local reason.
I've been asked to repeat the questions. Okay, two main questions. One is how do we build local disaster response or resilient community ecosystems? Does the co-op model fit in? And the second main question is what are the broader ecosystem supports needed? For example, how do we interact with government, for example, to coordinate those response strategies through cooperatives. So just planting those seeds. And actually, Bill offered a really interesting and useful framework of 4 stages of disaster response. So we can even think about those, which were mitigation.
Yeah, if you want to go back to them.
Yeah.
Maybe if we can put the slide back up.
Yeah, we can leave that up. Just putting food for thought. But
Yeah,
that's
mitigation,
the
preparedness, response, and recovery. So if you think about those 4 different stages.
Okay.
Hi, folks online. I'm going to join in here and help with the conversation. So folks who are online, if you'd like to turn your cameras on and unmute, we can have a bit of a conversation around the questions that Eva has posed. And we're so lucky Michael and Jamie are here with us to join us in the conversation. Um, Great. I'm seeing some cameras turn on. Really nice to have all of you here. I hope the background noise isn't too loud here. So there's a couple of questions here. How do we build local disaster response and resiliency? And how could co-ops play a part in that? And what are broader ecosystem supports? So I'll open it up. If folks want to jump in, feel free to unmute. This is very informal and I'll be taking some notes. Or questions for the speakers, since they're here with us. Oh, hi. Is this Deb? Okay, hi Deb. Unmute and feel free to join
Hi
in.
there. I actually work for the provincial government in Emergency Management BC for the Community Recovery Branch. And I'm a manager in Central, so Kamloops and area are all my communities that we've been working with. And we've been wondering the same question: how can we involve more, not only NGOs, but cooperatives, community futures groups, local business? How can we work together more? I also should say that outside of work, I do a lot of local, rural and remote community work in recovery. And more so through the community, we're wondering how to be more cohesive and work together more. But one question I had for Jamie and for the others, I guess, is how much are you able to, within what you do at cooperators, have the lens of building back better as from the Sendai framework, which is part of our Emergency Program Act, the modernization of it, that is. And I just wonder how much you're able to support people in rebuilding with insurance, suggesting or helping them say, maybe you want a smaller footprint, maybe you want different materials that are still within your insurance that you're going to be getting.
Yes, that's a great question, actually. So it's a bit of a two-pronged thing. There is some element of control you can have from an insurance company standpoint in terms of rebuilding and material selection and those types of things. And actually we have some endorsements that are available where you can actually upgrade some of your materials to be more eco-friendly and more resilient, and better for those types of environments. You know, one of the things we always see in the Alberta between Calgary and Airdrie, there's always a big massive hailstorm that comes through that every year, it seems, and it peels all the vinyl siding off houses, and we put more vinyl siding back on those houses, which really doesn't make any sense when you think about it. There's also the bigger topic around, you know, people tend to put themselves in harm's way. People like to live by the water. People like to live in the trees, and those are where things happen. And it's really hard it becomes a political issue at that point in time. How do you convince somebody not to build by the water after there's been a flood? How do you convince not to build on the side of that hill and those trees where it's just beautiful and scenic? How do you convince people to change their behaviors? So there's a lot of work that needs to go into this. And I think from an insurance standpoint, you know, we can offer things, but you can't force people to do things in a lot of ways. But I think where our opportunity really lies as carriers is to incentivize people to build back better. Like you say, if you're not going to relocate, how can you build in a more meaningful way that will protect you from those future losses is I think the space that we fit into that discussion.
Thanks.
Thanks. So Jamie, it sounds like that's sort of, I'm looking at this quadrant that's been shared, like that's very much in the recovery stage.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, and that's kind of where insurance exists. It's like your last line of defense. You've done everything you can to prevent it from happening, and now it's happened. So now we have to rebuild, and that's that recovery phase.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the other piece that I was hearing from Deb was around like, how do we engage these groups and how do we form these connections? That seems to be more in like the mitigation preparedness, maybe. So have these networks ready. And so when something happens, those are there. In Michael's presentation, he talks about the trust and having those social networks. They're ready to mobilize. They're ready to receive donations, contribute to purchasing and distributing to the community. So I'm curious about that. Oh, I see Ava's hand is up. We'll jump over to Ava.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Just what you were saying was raising some thoughts for me, where like we're building a house and a farm in a sort of medium to high fire risk area. And from what we've been hearing, because we're outside of a fire protection zone, we're expecting we might not even be eligible for house insurance, or if we are, it would just be, you know, over the top expensive, and that's on top of other kinds of insurance for farms becoming either very expensive or simply not available. We're in livestock, and if we start processing on farm, what we've been hearing is that we'll be uninsurable. Not because we're doing anything illegal, but simply nobody wants to insure that. And so I see a lot of room in there for these kind of producer-based cooperative insurance opportunities that if it's possible to cover these situations where the regular insurers just aren't interested. If anyone's able to speak to that, I'd love to hear more.
I think that's likely a me question again. And I probably don't have the best answer for you today, but it's definitely something to take away. It is something we're aware of. Farming, especially farming, is changing so much. You know, I grew up in Saskatchewan, and my dad rented farmland, and we went out and farmed every weekend, and did that for most of my youth. And I have lots of family that does it, but farming was always, you know, you either grew crops, or you had cattle, or you had some other livestock, and it was pretty, you know, you were in a lane or in a specific sector, and that's what you primarily did, and maybe you had a mixed grain or crops and livestock or something, but it wasn't too far outside of those boxes. But what's happening is people are diversifying their operations so much, that there's these crossover pieces where it's like, okay, well, this is farm, and that's one thing, but now you add this other layer, like the processing that you mentioned, which adds another complexity to it. And those are all things we're trying to, in our industry anyways, trying to address and stay on top of. And how do we do that? And where does this cross over from one product to another? And does it cross over? And do they need two products, or can we somehow build one solution that addresses all of these things? So there's a lot of work left to do in that space, I think. But we're aware of it, and we're trying to. It's just it's relatively new that it's become problematic to insure, and that has a lot to do with market conditions that we've seen in Canada, where you know, insurers are withdrawing, and there's less companies, and there's less willingness to accept risk, which is challenging to be in from an insurance standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point of the insurance, is to deal with risk. So if there was no risk, we wouldn't need insurance. But I'm also open to the possibility of insurance not being the solution. And if there is some other model of dealing with these kinds of risks, you know, arising out of climate change, and so many factors in this. You know, if there's any other way that people can work collectively together to support each other, to be able to survive these things, you know, for their farm to survive through experiencing something like this.
Great, Michael. I was just going to check in if you had some examples, and I see your hand is up. So if you want to jump in, Michael, please do.
Yeah. Ava, I was just going to mention, it wasn't part of the presentation, one of the other case studies in our report, so I encourage you to have a look at it and feel free to come back about this, is the Sweeter Banana Cooperative. And so that's a bunch of banana producers who set up a co-op for joint packing and transport and marketing. But and this next bit wasn't purely from the co-op. It was actually something the government set up with the producers in the 1960s, was the Banana Trust Fund. So they actually and the banana growers contribute. So I guess it's a different form of insurance called the Banana Trust Fund, because they have so many cyclones in that part of Australia, in Western Australia, this Banana Trust Fund was set up. And the farmers and the Sweeter Banana Co-op just love it. And I mean, I love the fact that, government was actually part of that solution. The government sort of looks after the funds. So after a disaster, the Banana Trust Fund is kind of very quick in supporting. So have a look at the report and the Sweeter Banana. It's only mentioned briefly because it didn't come out of the co-op, but it was mentioned as part of the context. So be happy, and maybe we can get you some more information about that Banana Trust Fund if you'd be interested. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'll look into that.
Thanks, Michael. I see Deb's hand is up. I'm not sure if it is still raised from earlier or if there is a new comment or question.
Oh, when it comes to community recovery, there's always a new comment or question.
Okay.
This one is, thank you for your comments, Ava. It's got my mind going in how cooperatives can work, that idea, we can work around better in community recovery. And also just tip of the hat to Australia because they're so far ahead of us in recovery and have so many great things going already. I've been following it for a few years and I'm in touch with a number of people down there in emergency preparedness and recovery. And it's unfortunately probably because of the disasters you've had that you are, but it's a lot of really good examples we can look at more closely in being prepared and being prepared for recovery, which is, in my experience, one of the hardest things to get over with people, because who wants to believe anything's going to happen to them? So why should they prepare for recovery? So anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering if, I think we have a couple of minutes left. I didn't really track that very well. Wondering if we could spend a little bit of time on preparedness. If folks have seen some good examples, or what does that look like? How can co-ops support that part of this?
Michelle, I'm happy just to kick off with a quick comment that what we saw out of Australia, particularly with the bushfires and probably with the the West Australian cyclones a couple of years earlier, I don't think the co-ops actually thought about preparedness for disasters. That wasn't in their mind. However, the successful role they played in the recovery actually has served as preparedness for the next one. And I think that is now recognised. And so it's almost like getting that sense that there's a bit of a continuum there. I certainly, when I look at the framework that Bill shared, which is great, and sort of
navigating the
internationally
integrated format is challenging.
But I think the co-ops very much are on the preparedness and recovery feeds into preparedness for the next one. A lot of the mitigation and response in Australia is really with the emergency services and government, but all working together. If you make sure, I guess my key point is when you recover well, make sure you don't lose those lessons, feed those into preparedness for next time.
Great, thank you. There is a cyclic part to
Hello.
this, and we're going to rejoin the main session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yes, we hear Michelle. Okay, I think we're all back together. It's time to share back in the last few minutes here. So does anyone from any table want to share any insights about specifically perhaps cooperative strategies for both resilience at the local level or at the broader level of the Canadian or international ecosystem. Yes, Mario?
Yes, I'll actually say something else, because what I heard was not about cooperatives formally, but Judy told the story of her experience in her community, High River, which flooded in 2013, and what were the critical sort of things to supersede that and get back on their feet. And it was ultimately relationships, right? These were not formally incorporated relationships through a cooperative, but through a network of friends and family of a community. They were able to, very quickly establish a decent baseline to continue to live there and stay, not have to leave. And that was the key difference that allowed them to stay, was those networks. So sometimes they're not going to be articulated through a cooperative, but these are the key things. What that made me think of was the heat dome last year in BC, and the big concentration of deaths among people who didn't have anybody to check on them, especially elderly folks, right? So it is that relational piece that's fundamental. And then co-ops, of course, are one way to kind of structure and give an infrastructure, organizational infrastructure to these relationships, but they are not the thing itself sometimes.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to share? Marc-Andre?
Thanks, Eva. The gentleman who was here a moment ago was telling us a story where in November 2019, they did a disaster planning scenario around a pandemic. So he had some practical experience to share with us, but a lot of what he said resonated with what we've heard here is about those networks. They were in a good position when the pandemic landed because they already had built out those networks and those plans. So that was one point. But the other point that emerged, I think, strongly from our conversation was, and this was just mentioned, was making sure that you bring in the right people. And oftentimes at a community level, that'll mean especially targeting disadvantaged groups who otherwise don't have the capacity or are left out of the conversation. So that was something that I think we landed on fairly strongly. And then my own personal favorite, and I'll leave it at this, was that, and in Bill's presentation mentioned this indirectly, was the policy supports. Larger levels, higher levels of government can enable this planning and fund it or help structure it. And I think that would be important, and then letting the locals figure out who's in and how it works could be a way to think about this too.
Thank you. Is there anyone maybe in the online discussion that would like to share what came out of your conversation?
Yeah, anyone in the group, feel free to jump in, or I could provide a summary as well.
Take it away, Michelle.
Okay. There were definitely similar threads of looking at social networks and that being a key piece of it. We have Deb online, and she's involved in emergency response provincially. And how do we have more NGOs and cooperatives involved in building that network? So I hope that's something that we continue the conversation on and start to strengthen those networks. We heard about incentivizing Build Back Better and how there's maybe a bit of a mindset shift for folks. Like we do like to build near water, and then we're impacted by flooding. We like to have places in the woods and are impacted by wildfires. And so part of the recovery may be considering some shifts in where we're living. And then Michael shared an example of the Banana Trust Fund, which basically is a partnership with the government, and they help to look after the funds, and the producers have contributed to that fund over many years. It started in the 60s, I think. And so the producers can draw from that, and it's a very fast response rate to support producers in a cyclone prone area. The other key piece was when there is good recovery, to learn from that, and that to inform preparedness and to continue to put into practice the things that were learned from the recovery. So if I got anything off base, folks, jump in and correct me. Thumbs up. Okay.
That's great. Thanks everyone for sharing. We are near the end of our time. Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Just on the resilience part, I don't often commend Congress in the United States, but I will commend Congress for something. Back a couple of years ago, they included a provision in law that for every disaster appropriation, and it used to be there'd be a disaster appropriation once every few years. Now it's every year. 6% of the disaster appropriation has to go to future community resilience. And that what you can do is apply for grants to build local community resilience. And as you can imagine, given the scale of disasters, $120 billion, that's $8 billion that was made available to anybody in the local community who's looking at building resilience. I couldn't find whether Canada had a similar kind of fund, but that's something where you'd want to look to BCCA and others to research that and see if there are other sources of government funding that might be helpful. I know as cooperatives, we tend to say we're self-help tradition. We don't necessarily want the government involved in our business, but if government has available dollars to build community resilience, why not?
Yeah, that's a great concluding thought. Do any of the other speakers want to share any final thoughts?
Michael here. Look, thanks for the opportunity. I mean, something that came up in the small group too was the online group was, you know, some commending of Australia for what we've done, and things have certainly improved here. One thing that we're really keen here is to learn from developing countries. I just want to sort of throw that out from some of our work we've done with Vanuatu, in particular around cyclone recovery. In some ways, they're way ahead of us, and they have the co-ops in the room right at the beginning. So just learn from developing countries who are so used to dealing with disasters, often even more than us. So wasn't part of my presentation, but just an extra thought to leave us all with. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Jamie?
Yeah, just I guess a bit of a closing thought here is one thing I didn't maybe mention is I'm currently studying in the master's program for co-ops and credit unions, and so my head is constantly going around cooperatives and where do we fit in this space, and working for a national insurance company, and you know, where do we go from here? But I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for cooperatives to get in on this space and to partner with the insurance companies or whoever to find ways to bridge these gaps, to help people be more resilient, to help them manage these types of risks that they're exposed to, and not just from a reactionary standpoint, which insurance is very reactionary. Something happens, you call your insurance and it kicks in. Getting in front of it so those phone calls don't have to happen. And I think co-ops have a tremendous opportunity there to get into that space and start that discussion at the kind of the grassroots level and build up from there, and work with community partners and work with national organizations and every step in between.
Absolutely. And I think there's a role for cooperation among co-ops. We're very well positioned to develop strategies in a coordinated way at all levels and all stages of disaster resilience. So that's the end of the session. Thank you everyone for your active participation.
Thanks everyone, and thanks BCCA.